From the burning churches of France and Italy to a jungle paradise warped into a hellish nightmare, these are disturbing punishments from World War II. First is Marzabotto. As a punishment for Italian and Bolognese partisan fighting, the Waffen forces entered the town of Marzabotto and the surrounding villages on the 29th of September 1944. Walter Ritter led the 16th Panzer Grenadiers on one of the most devastating mass destructions of civilians in the Western European theater. The carnage was systematic and widespread, with a minimum of 770 civilians perishing in the spans of a few days, while upper estimates reach 1,800 or higher. Entire towns were emptied and wiped out across the Monte Sol Massif. Some people, like Giovanni Fornasini, stayed behind, helping civilians to escape into the woods to the resistance, but even he was eventually caught and suffered a terrible fate. Buildings were then torched, razing centuries-old villages to the ground and dooming any who had hidden inside. Actions such as this were widespread in German-controlled areas, especially when there was heavy partisan activity. Next is Oradour Sur Glane. French partisans were among the most successful and well-supplied throughout the war, being only a short plane ride or boat ride from England. Supplies could be ferried across consistently. So on the 10th of June 1944, one of many German reprisals began. In south-central France, in the town of Oradour Sur Glane, hundreds of civilians were brought together. Some were travelers, others were from the surrounding farms and villages, but in all, around 700 people were brought together in the village. The men were taken to the barn, where multiple soldiers aimed at the legs, preventing them from running. Gasoline was then poured and the barn destroyed. The rest, who weren't adult men, were locked inside a church, which was then immolated. In all, an estimated 643 people lost their lives. The partisans did not stop their activity, and retaliatory harm was often severe and horrific on both sides. Next are Papuan Porters. The beautiful jungle of Papua was turned into a hellscape by the Japanese invasion of the South Pacific. Rugged mountains, thick jungle, and unpredictable weather bogged down the Japanese advance overland to Port Moresby, and brutal jungle fighting began to sap both sides. The Japanese had intended to carve a road through the jungle, but this was impractical, and so both sides relied heavily on Papuan Porters to carry their ammunition, food, and wounded in and out of the jungle. The Australians paid a cheap and nearly exploitative wage, while the Japanese paid with the bayonet. After the Australian and American forces pushed the Japanese out of Papua, the extent of the horrific destruction was uncovered. Japanese officers seemed to want to familiarize their soldiers with taking life, with brutality and cruelty. Mass devastations of Papuan villagers were discovered in multiple locations. Next were supplies found from somewhere. A strange meat was discovered in a Japanese fort during their retreat through Papua. By the time the Australians and Americans were pushing the Japanese back across Papua, the submarine blockade had become crippling. Most of the food in the Japanese Empire went to the soldiers, but even then the supplies were seriously low. During the campaigns across Papua, an advancing group of Australians entered a fortified Japanese jungle base. The wounded from weeks of fighting were discovered lined up alongside the sick and starving. All had been ended by their comrades before they fled. There was no food left, and chewed bark was found around the fighting pits, but worst still was meat that, when analyzed, was determined to not come from any known livestock or wild animal, leaving only one option as to where it came from. Some accounts from Japanese soldiers at the time seemed to support this hypothesis. Next are barrier troops. We've all seen the classic enemy at the gate scene, where beleaguered Soviet conscripts retreat from the line at Stalingrad and are put down by their own troops. The reality is far more grim. Soldiers would be caught. The war was one of national survival, and any Soviet soldier seen fleeing the brutal battle would be at serious risk of being caught or ratted out. Then the NKVD would collect them, hold a short trial behind a barn, and the last thing through their mind would be 9 grams of lead. No one was safe from this either. Commanders, officers, and even generals could all face the lethal charge of cowardice or worse, treason. If you weren't immediately sent to the afterlife, you would be put into a penal battalion and used as sacrificial pawns to protect the more valuable troops. Next is the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in 1940 following the German and Soviet partition of Poland. It held some 460,000 Jews at its peak, all surviving in cramped conditions and meager rations. But in 1943, the cleansing of the ghetto was planned, and Polish and Jewish partisans prepared to act. The initial days were costly for the Germans and the advance into the ghetto was stalled, but no partisan force could have stopped the upcoming devastation. What could have was the Soviet army camped just miles away, but instead the Soviets waited, allowing the Germans and partisans they would have to fight eventually to destroy one another. Over 56,000 Jews lost their lives in the fighting or were deported to the worst of the camps. Next is the raising of Friesoythe. As the war neared its end, the Canadian 4th Armored Division was pushing through Saxony. During the battle to take Friesoythe, the divisional commander was hit, and rumors spread amongst the Canadians that it was a German civilian who had done it. It had actually been a German military sniper, but in retaliation, the town of Friesoythe was emptied and razed. Over 20 German civilians lost their lives during the retribution, and the event remains a dark stain on the Canadian military history. Next is Gudovac. After being appointed to rule by a joint Italian and German invasion, the Stasi quickly turned on the Serbian population of Croatia and committed such atrocities that even the Waffen and Gestapo thought them to be cruel and extreme. Gudovac would be the location of the first large-scale destruction of civilians by the Stasi. Some 196 people were ended in just this one village on one day. Over the next 5 years, people from around the country would be brought in train cars to pits throughout the nation that would soon be filled. Several 100,000 civilians would be lost over the course of the war. Next are the Juramentados. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, nothing was quite as terrifying to the soldiers as the Juramentados. Fanatical swordsmen, these warriors accepted that they would not survive their mission and engaged in horrifying and brutally effective ambushes. Moro warriors would be documented as intentionally impaling themselves on bayonets so that they could ensure that their enemy could not run from them. They were adept at hiding blades on their person and lashing out when least expected, or at waiting for hours silently in the night until a patrol could be ambushed. The sacrifice and brutality of the Juramentados were critical in crushing the Japanese will to fight before the Americans arrived. And finally is Meymac. How far does justice have to go before it becomes retribution or revenge? Is revenge a justifiable excuse for brutality? In 1944, following the devastatingly successful Normandy beach landings, the resistance were fighting hard to slow and degrade German forces. One such event happened at Meymac, where a group of French resistance fighters gathered nearly 50 German soldiers and ended their lives. The soldiers had dug their pits themselves and were laid to rest one by one. One French woman who had collaborated with the occupiers was included, for a total of 47 prisoners who were put down. The event was finally revealed by 95-year-old resistance member Edmond Reveil, the last living witness of the crime. Though the bodies have not been found, several pieces of evidence supporting Edmond's story have been, and it seems to only be a matter of time. Those were gruesome World War II punishments that will leave you disturbed. I hope to see you next time.